My name is Eleanor Barrett, and at 36, I learned that the most expensive word in my father's vocabulary was disappointment. I had just been promoted to Lieutenant Colonel in the United States Air Force. 14 years of dawn patrols, remote deployments, and midnight study sessions had earned me the silver oak leaf on my collar. When I invited my family to the modest ceremony, my father didn't even pretend to consider attending. My mother smoothed things over the way she always had, with gentle deflections and hollow reassurances. My brother never returned my call at all, so I pinned on my new rank with the help of colleagues who shared none of my blood. And I told myself that was perfectly fine. 2 weeks later, a photograph placed me on the front page of the regional newspaper. There I was at the Pentagon, flanked by two security officers whom a careless caption labeled my personal guards. That picture gave my family a sudden, urgent reason to remember my phone number. My mother called within a day. "We need to talk," she said. "Family meeting tomorrow." What I did before I drove out to meet them is the rest of this story. The promotion ceremony had been held in a conference room with tired carpet and genuine intentions. My squadron commander spoke briefly about resilience under pressure. A handful of airmen I trusted stood along the wall. The silver oak leaf was cool between my fingers. When I lifted it, cooled away. Metal gets when it has been waiting in an open case all morning. Tradition dictates that someone who loves you pins it on. I had saved 2 chairs in the front row, the way a person saves a seat out of habit rather than hope. They remained empty throughout the entire ceremony. My technical sergeant, a quiet man named Reeves, finally stepped forward and performed the honors so the moment wouldn't pass without witness. I thanked him and meant every word. Afterward, there was sheet cake and mediocre coffee, and people clapped me on the shoulder, and I smiled and answered their questions about my new assignment. The whole time, I kept my phone face up on the table near the napkins. No message came, not from my mother, not from my father, not from my brother, who had a phone practically fused to his palm. I won't pretend it didn't sting, because resilience is not the same as numbness, and I have never pretended otherwise. I picked up the empty case, slid the spare leaf into my pocket, and drove back to base alone. The radio played something forgettable, and I let it. There is a particular quiet that follows a day that should have been shared. I had grown accustomed to that quiet long before I earned the right to a larger caller. A week before the ceremony, I had called the house to invite them. My mother answered, which meant my father was within earshot. I kept it simple: the date, the time, the base address, the offer to reserve lodging nearby. There was a pause, the kind that means someone is covering the receiver and speaking low. Then my father's voice came on, never warm. "We're not wasting our time on your little promotion ceremony," he said. I have replayed that sentence more times than I care to admit. He didn't call it small. He called it a waste. In his mind, there was a hierarchy of service, and I had landed on the wrong rung. My father spent 22 years as an enlisted airman, retiring as a chief master sergeant. Somewhere along the way, he decided that officers were people who signed papers while other men bled. When his daughter became one and worse, a logistics officer who lived in contracts and oversight, he heard it as betrayal. Not real service, he liked to say. I didn't argue. Arguing with my father was like arguing with a locked door. You could pound on it all day, and the only thing that moved was you. So I said understood, which is a word service members use when there's nothing left to say. And I hung up before my voice could betray me. I sat in my kitchen for a while, then made a list of the people who would actually come. The list was short, and short was honest, and I had learned to prefer honest. I didn't yet know how soon waste would come back around. My mother called back that evening, and she didn't apologize because in our family, apology was foreign currency nobody kept on hand. She called to manage me. "Don't make it harder on your father," she said. "You know how he is." I didn't know how he was. I had spent a childhood learning the weather of him. What took me longer to understand was my mother's role in it. Margaret Barrett was not cruel. She was a peacekeeper. And peacekeepers learned that the cheapest way to keep a difficult man calm is to give him less to be jealous of. When I brought home a good report card, she would set it on the counter and say, "Don't wave it around." When I earned a scholarship to college, she told the relatives it was just a small program. She wasn't trying to wound me. She was lowering my temperature so my father wouldn't boil. I figured that out as an adult, sitting in a counselor's office on a base far from home. The understanding didn't make it hurt less. It only made it sadder. "We'll talk as a family," she said on the phone. The way she always closed things, as if the family were a committee that met and adjourned. "Mom," I said, "I just wanted you there." There was a silence on her end that I have since learned to recognize as the sound of a woman choosing peace over her own daughter. "I know, honey," she said. Then she changed the subject to my brother's new truck, and I let her, because some nights you don't have it in you to fight onto fronts. My brother Nathan is 3 years younger than me and was, in my father's accounting, the family's real investment. While I was the daughter who signed papers, Nathan was the son who made real money. He worked as a liaison for a subcontractor that fed into defense work. The kind of job where the title is vague and the parking lot is full of trucks worth more than the building. My father loved to talk about Nathan's deals. He didn't understand them and didn't need to. The numbers were big and the trucks were new, and that was a language he respected. At family gatherings, my father would steer every conversation toward Nathan's latest win, and my own work would sit at the table like an uninvited guest. I told myself it didn't matter. Mostly I believed it, but I had started to notice things. The way you notice a draft before you find the open window. Nathan's house had gotten bigger. His vacations had gotten longer. The watch on his wrist at Thanksgiving was the kind I had, priced once by accident in an airport and then put down quickly. A liaison salary is a good salary. It is not that salary. I never said anything. It wasn't my business. And Nathan had a way of turning questions into accusations, and accusations into reasons to call me jealous. So I filed it away the way I file most things, quietly and without comment. I didn't know then that the open window I had half noticed would one day let in the entire storm. I only knew my brother was living a little louder than his paycheck should have allowed, and that nobody in my family was the type to ask why. People who hear this story always ask the same thing. Why did you keep showing up? Why drive 2 hours to a house where the front row chairs stay empty? The honest answer isn't the flattering one. It wasn't that I was naive about my family. I knew exactly who they were. It was that I had cast myself very young as the one who held the line the oldest, the steady one, the daughter who didn't need things, so that the household could spend its small supply of patience on the ones who did. Somewhere along the way, I confused that role with love, and I confused my silence with peace. If I just kept the visits cordial, if I just absorbed the slights and changed the subject, then the family wouldn't fracture on my watch. That was the story I told myself. It's a common story. A lot of people are living inside it right now. The trouble with being the steady one is that everyone comes to expect the steadiness, and nobody asks what it costs you. I had become so good at carrying that I forgot I was allowed to set things down. So I showed up. I brought the dish. I asked about Nathan's deals. I let my mother lower my temperature, and I drove home each time a little hollow rant called it keeping the peace. If you grew up being the steady one, the one who kept things calm so no one else had to, you already know how heavy quiet can get. That autumn, my career took a turn I hadn't chased. I was reassigned to a small oversight cell whose work touched the integrity of defense procurement. In plain words, my job became helping ensure that the government's contracting process stayed honest, that bids were real, that estimates weren't cooked, that the people awarding contracts weren't quietly steering them. It's unglamorous work. It's also the kind of work that, done right, saves taxpayers more money than any single service member will ever cost. I didn't announce the new posting. I didn't post a photo or send a group text. My father would have found a way to call oversight, paper pushing with a clipboard, and I wasn't in the mood to hand him the opening. So I moved my few belongings, learned the new faces, and got to work. The cell was careful by design. We were trained on conflicts of interest until the words felt carved into us. If you have any personal connection to a matter, you flag it, you step back, you put it in writing. The standard was not suggestion. It was law and regulation, and the kind of habit that keeps careers and convictions clean. I remember thinking that first week that it was a strange comfort to land. Somewhere the rules were written down. My family ran on unwritten rules that changed depending on my father's mood. Here, at least, the lines were drawn in ink. I didn't yet know how soon. One of those lines would run straight through my own kitchen table. I only knew I liked the clarity. After a lifetime of weather, clarity felt like dry ground. Let me tell you the thing I was actually afraid of losing, because it wasn't what my family thought. They believed I was hungry for their approval, that if they withheld it long enough, I would do anything to earn it back. They were wrong, and that wrongness would cost them. What I was afraid of losing was the one thing I had built entirely on my own. Not the rank can be pinned on and taken off. Men with worse hearts than mine have worn bigger leaves. What I was afraid of losing was my own word, the ability to stand in a room and have my yes mean yes. I had grown up watching adults bend the truth to keep a man happy, and I had decided somewhere around the age of 12 that I would not live that way. That decision was the spine of me. It was the part my father called cold and my mother called difficult, and my counselor more kindly called integrity. I didn't think of it as a virtue. I thought of it as load-bearing. Take it out, and the whole structure of me would come down. So when I tell you what I did later, when the pressure came, I want you to understand, it was never a hard call in the way people imagine. It only looked hard from the outside. From the inside, it was the simplest thing in the world. You don't saw off the beam you're standing on. My phone buzzed on the nightstand early, before the alarm. The screen lit up with my mother's name at 5:45 in the morning, a time she reserved for emergencies and bad news. My family didn't call at dawn to say good morning. Something had changed. It turned out the change was a photograph. The regional paper had run a feature on local service members, and there in the middle of the spread was a picture from a Pentagon event I had attended for work. I was in dress uniform, mid-stride, and on either side of me walked two men in dark suits who were part of the venue's security detail for the day. The caption, written by someone in a hurry, said I was photographed with two bodyguards. It wasn't true, but it didn't need to be true to do its work. In a small town, a photograph like that travels faster than any correction. By breakfast, half the county had seen the daughter who pushed papers standing at the Pentagon, looking to their eyes important, powerful, even. The irony is that I was less powerful than I looked and more constrained than anyone guessed. But my family didn't see constraint. They saw leverage. They saw a daughter who suddenly mattered to the kind of people who decide things. My mother's dawn call was not to congratulate me. I knew that before I answered. People who skip your ceremony don't call at dawn to celebrate you. They call at dawn because something of theirs is on fire, and they have just remembered you own a hose. I let the phone ring twice while I sat up. Then I answered and made my voice flat and ready. Mom, what's wrong? Nothing's wrong, my mother said in the bright voice she used when something was very wrong. We just think it's time the family got together. It's been too long. Too long was true. It had been months of careful distance since the ceremony, but the warmth in her voice was new. And new warmth from my mother always had a price tag I couldn't yet read. It's 5:45 in the morning, I said. What is this about? Does a mother need a reason to want her children together? She said, and the deflection was so practiced I almost admired it. I didn't let it go. I had spent my new job learning to ask the uncomfortable question early, before the room could close around it. Mom, I said, I love you, but you don't call me at dawn for a reunion. Tell me what's going on with Nathan. The silence that came back was the loudest thing she had said all morning. We need to talk, she finally said. The brightness gone now, replaced by something tighter. We need to talk, all of us, as a family. Come out Saturday. Your father wants you there. Your father wants you there. In 36 years, I wasn't sure he had ever once wanted me there. That alone told me how bad it was. I said I would come, and I meant it though not for the reason she hoped. I hung up and sat in the gray light with a cold feeling spreading in my chest. The kind that comes when you can see the shape of a thing before anyone has named it. They needed something, and it had Nathan's fingerprints on it. The campaign started before I had even finished my coffee. My father texted me, which he did roughly never. Morning, sweetheart, it said. I read it 3 times to be sure my eyes were working. My father called me by my name when he was pleased, and by nothing at all when he was not. Sweetheart was a word he saved for waitresses and women he wanted something from. I knew the smell of that text away. You know rain coming. Then my sister-in-law Vanessa joined in. She sent a photo of my nephew 6 years old and gap-toothed, holding a drawing he had made. He's been asking when Aunt Ellie is coming, she wrote. Maybe he had. Children aren't props, even when the adults around them try to use them as such. But I noticed the timing, months of silence. And now suddenly my dawn was full of warmth from people who had skipped my biggest day. Real love doesn't arrive on a schedule that lines up this neatly with a need. I didn't answer the texts right away, not out of spite, but out of caution. When the people who have ignored you for years all reach for you in the same 48 hours, the kind thing to assume is coincidence, and the wise thing to assume is choreography. I had spent enough of my life being kind in that exact spot to know better now. I put the phone down and went to work. All day, under the routine of it. A single question kept turning over in my mind like a stone in a shoe. What did they need that only the daughter at the Pentagon could give them? By the end of the week, I would have my answer. I didn't have to like it. The answer found me at work before my family handed it over. And it found me in the worst possible way. I wasn't investigating anything to do with my brother. I want to be clear about that, because it matters. But oversight work means names cross your desk, company names, contract numbers, the dull paperwork of who is buying what from whom. And one afternoon, a name went by that I recognized. It was the prime contractor that sat above the subcontractor where Nathan worked. Nathan's small firm did almost all of its business with that one company, a dependency he had bragged about at more than one holiday dinner. The file wasn't mine to open. It carried markings that told me it belonged to an active matter, the kind worked by people with badges and very specific authority. I did the only correct thing. I didn't open it. I didn't read past what was already in front of me. I noted the date and the fact of it, closed the folder, and felt the floor tilt a few degrees under my chair. Coincidence is a real thing, and I am not a woman who jumps at shadows. A prime contractor can have 100 subcontractors and 1,000 employees, and most of them go to work and come home and never break a law. But I thought about the bigger house, the longer vacations, the watch I had priced once and put down fast. I thought about my mother's dawn phone call and my father's sudden sweetheart, and the gap-toothed photo of my nephew deployed like a chess piece. The cold feeling in my chest, the one that had been spreading since Tuesday, settled into something colder and more certain. I didn't know the details. I would make sure I never learned them improperly. But I knew the country my family was about to ask me to walk into. And I knew it had no good roads out. So I did the thing the rules had carved into me. I called a lawyer before I called my family back. Not a civilian attorney, but a judge advocate general officer named Captain Holloway, who handled exactly these kinds of knots. I kept it general because I didn't have specifics and didn't want them improperly. Hypothetically, I said, if a service member in an oversight role learns a close relative might be connected to a matter in her lane, what is her obligation? Holloway didn't hesitate. It's not hypothetical the second it's real, she said. The moment you have a personal connection to a matter, you recuse. You step back from anything touching it. You disclose it in writing up your chain. And if anyone, family included, asks you to use your position to influence it, that gets disclosed up your chain too. Depending on the office and how serious it is, it may need to be reported through the proper channels. I asked the question I already knew the answer to. And if I don't, then you put your career, your clearance, and possibly your freedom on the same fire as theirs, she said. There is no version of helping that helps. I thanked her and sat with it. Here is what I want you to understand, because the rest of the story turns on it. I was not a woman who stumbled, lined into a trap and got rescued by a clever twist at the end. Before I ever drove out to that family meeting, I knew exactly where the edges of the cliff were. And I had walked the line with my own feet and a flashlight. Whatever they were about to ask, I already knew it would be a thing I could not do. The only question left was how I would say no, and whether I would have the spine to say it to their faces. I intended to. That night, I took out the one piece of my family I have always kept close. It didn't come from the people who raised me. It came from my grandfather. He was my mother's father, quiet man who fought in Korea and came home and farmed, and never raised his voice in my hearing. He was the only relative who took my service seriously. The day I was commissioned, before any of the rest of this, he handed me a folded letter and told me not to read it until I needed it. I had read it exactly twice in the years since. I read it a third time that night at my kitchen table, under the one lamp that worked. His handwriting was small and deliberate, a farmer's careful hand. Most of it was plain, the kind of plain that takes a whole life to earn. But there was one line I had underlined myself years ago, so I would never have to search for it. Rank can be pinned on and taken off, he had written. Integrity is the only thing they can't reassign. Under it, almost as an afterthought, he had added a sentence that I hadn't understood at 23 and understood completely now. Family doesn't ask you to lie. People who love you never make your honesty the price of belonging. I sat with that for a long time. My grandfather had known my father for 40 years. He had watched a difficult man raise his grandchildren, and he had chosen his words for a moment exactly like this one, a moment he must have seen coming before I did. I folded the letter back along its soft, worn creases and slid it into the inside pocket of my jacket, where it would stay until the family meeting. I would need to remember whose granddaughter I was. The other half was about to test it. Saturday came gray and early. I drove the 2 hours out to my parents' house, the same 2 hours I had driven 100 times, past the same gas station and the same church sign that had been promising a fall festival since spring. I knew the road well enough to think while I drove, and I didn't love what I was thinking. When I pulled into the driveway, the first thing that reached me before I even shut off the engine was the smell. My father kept the garage door up year-round, and the air there always carried the same two notes: burnt coffee from the percolator he ran all day, and the heavy sweetness of motor oil. I had smelled that combination my whole childhood. It used to mean home. That morning, it just meant the place where I would have to be careful. Halfway up the drive, my phone buzzed. Vanessa again. The whole family is counting on you, the message read. No greeting, no nephew this time. Just the weight of it sat on my shoulders before I had even rung the bell. I sat in the car a minute longer than I needed to. I touched a letter in my jacket pocket, the way some people touch a cross knot for luck, but to remember a promise. Then I went in. The house was warmer than I had felt it in years, and not from the furnace. My mother had made my favorite casserole, a dish she hadn't bothered with since I was a teenager. My father stood up when I came and actually stood in the unfamiliarity of it told me more than any words could have. You don't rule out the good behavior for a daughter you respect. You roll it out for a daughter you're about to ask for a great deal. The performance was almost good enough to be sad. My father asked about my drive. He asked about the new, posting the one he had called paper, pushing for years and nodded along as if he had always found it fascinating. My mother kept my plate full and my coffee hot and laughed at things that weren't funny. Nathan was there, looking thinner than I remembered, with a smile that didn't reach the rest of his face. Vanessa sat close to him with my nephew on her lap, and the little boy, to his credit, was the only honest person in the room. He showed me his drawing and asked if my uniform had a sword. I told him no sword, just a lot of paperwork. And he lost interest immediately, which I respected. For a while, we ate and talked around the thing. I let them. I have learned that if you stay quiet, people who want something will eventually run out of small talk and arrive at it themselves. And you will learn more from how they get there than from the asking. So I ate my mother's casserole and watched my family circle the point like water finding a drain. My father set down his fork. He reached over and put his hand on my shoulder, the same shoulder Sergeant Reese had touched when he pinned my rank. And the comparison landed in my chest like a stone. We're family first, right? My father said. Whatever else, family first. I looked at the hand on my shoulder. I looked at my brother, who wouldn't meet my eyes. I looked at my mother, who was suddenly very interested in the tablecloth. And I understood that the meeting had finally begun. It was Nathan who finally said it, though my father had clearly rehearsed him. I'm in some trouble, my brother began. Then the story came out in pieces, the way a confession does when the person is more sorry about the consequences than the act. There was an investigation federal. It touched the contracting work his company did, the bids, the cost estimates, the awards. He used a lot of words like technicality, and everybody does it. And the government just doesn't understand how the business works. I listened without interrupting. When he ran out of euphemisms, my father took over. And my father didn't deal in euphemisms. You're at the Pentagon now, he said. You're in that exact world. You know people. You can make a call. Slow it down. Get them to look the other way. You can fix this for your brother. And there it was, the whole reason for the dawn calls and the sudden sweetheart. And my nephew's drawing. They didn't want me at the family meeting. They wanted the woman in the photograph, the one they thought had power. And they wanted her to spend it on the son they had actually chosen. Vanessa leaned forward, my nephew still on her lap, and delivered the line they had saved for last. Family takes care of family, she said softly. Like a kindness, which is the cruelest way to say a thing like that. I didn't raise my voice. I set down my coffee. I looked at the people who had skipped my ceremony, asking me now to set fire to everything that ceremony stood for. And I felt something in me go very still and very clear. They had no idea what they were actually asking. Or maybe they did, and had simply decided my conscience was a smaller thing than Nathan's comfort. Either way, the asking was done. Now it was my turn to answer. Before I answered, I made sure they understood exactly what they had put on the table. I didn't want anyone later to claim they hadn't known. I want to make sure I'm hearing you, I said in the even voice I use when the stakes are highest. You're asking me to use my official position to interfere with a federal investigation, to call someone, lean on them, and get a case slowed down or steered. Is that right? My father's jaw tightened. He didn't like hearing it in plain English. I'm asking you to help your family, he said. Same thing, different words. I said, what you're describing is obstruction. It's a federal crime, not for Nathan, for me. The room went quiet. Nathan finally looked at me, and what I saw in his face was not remorse, it was calculation. The look of a man weighing whether his sister's conscience could be argued away. "Come on, Ellie," he said, using the old nickname like a tool. "Nobody's going to know. You'd be doing one phone call. I would know," I said. "And so would the people whose job it is to catch exactly this." I wasn't angry or not in the hot way they expected. I was something colder and harder to argue with, because here is what they had never understood about me. Even after 36 years, my integrity was not a position I could be talked off of. It was the floor I stood on. You cannot negotiate a person out of the ground beneath their feet. Nathan must have sensed it, because his face changed, and the pleading curdled into something uglier. He had asked nicely, and it hadn't worked. Now I suspected he would try the other, the thing my family always reached for when nice failed: pressure. They had a great deal of it, and they were about to spend all of it at once. My father went first, because pressure was his native tongue. "After everything this family did for you," he said, "this is how you pay it back. We raised you. We fed you. And the one time we need something, you hide behind your rules." I almost laughed, not from humor, but from the sheer reach of it. The family that skipped my ceremony, that called my life's work a waste, was now presenting me with an invoice. "You owe this family," my father said, and he said it like a closing argument. My mother, who had been silent, added her quieter weight. "We're not asking you to do anything wrong, honey," she said. "We're just asking you to help. That's what families do." That was the moment I finally saw the whole machine, all of it. The way you suddenly see a pattern in wallpaper you have stared at for years. My years of silence, of absorbing, of being the steady one who never needed anything. They had not been read by my family as love. They had been read as a balance, a reserve of obligation they could draw on whenever they chose. I had spent 36 years making deposits into an account they believed they could withdraw from at will. And now they had walked up to the window with a slip that said, "Commit a felony, or you are not family." I didn't slam the table. I didn't cry. I asked for one night, not because I needed to think about whether to help. That answer was already as solid as my grandfather's letter in my pocket. I asked for one night because I knew exactly what I had to do. And I needed to do it correctly, through the right doors, in the right order, before I ever said the word no out loud to their faces. I drove the 2 hours back to base in a silence I didn't fill with the radio. People expect, at this point in a story like mine, that the wrong daughter starts planning her revenge. They want the part where I lie awake, designing the perfect way to make them all sorry. I have to disappoint you a little. I was not planning revenge. Revenge is a hot thing, and what I felt on that drive was not heat. It was clarity, cool and total, like the air right after a storm finally passes. Here is the truth about boundaries that took me 36 years to learn. A boundary is not a weapon. It is not a thing you do to someone. It is a line you draw for yourself and then keep, even when the keeping costs you. I was not going to call anyone to hurt Nathan. The federal investigators didn't need my help, and it would have been wrong to give it. I was not going to record my family or confront them or trap them into some dramatic admission. That is not what calm looks like, and it is not what justice looks like either. What I was going to do was much quieter and much harder for them to fight, precisely because it asked nothing of them. I was going to follow the rules I had promised to follow, all the way through, no matter who it cost. I was going to tell the truth to the people I was required to tell it to. And then I was going to tell the truth to my family once, to their faces. And then I was going to leave. By the time I reached the base, the plan was not a plan anymore. It was just the next right thing, and the one after that. So I started first thing Monday. I did exactly what Captain Holloway had told me to do, and what the regulations had carved into me from my first week in the cell. I disclosed. I sat down and wrote it out plainly and completely. I documented that a close relative might be connected to a matter that touched my lane. I formally recused myself from anything that came near it. so that no one could ever say I had so much as breathed on Nathan's case. And then I did the part that was harder to write and impossible to leave out. I reported that members of my family had asked me to use my position to interfere with a federal investigation. I didn't editorialize. I didn't call my father names or describe my brother's smile. I wrote the facts, the date, the request, the words "slow it down and make a call," and I signed it. The folder of paperwork sat on my desk when I was done, a plain manila folder, and the weight of it on my lap as I carried it to my chain felt heavier than its few pages had any right to. I want to be careful here, because this is the part people misunderstand. I didn't turn my brother in. I didn't have the power to indict him, and I didn't want it. Nathan's case belonged to investigators and prosecutors who had been working it long before I knew it existed. People with the authority and the evidence that I deliberately never touched. What I turned in was not my brother. It was the attempt to corrupt me. There is a difference, and the difference is everything. By disclosing and recusing, I took myself off the board entirely. I made it so that nothing my family did could pull me down with them. It was the most loving thing I could do, though none of them would ever see it that way. It was also the safest. Sometimes those are the same act. For a few days, the strangest thing happened. My family thought I had said yes. I had asked for a night to think, and to them, a night to think meant a night to come around. When I didn't immediately refuse, they filled the silence with the answer they wanted. My mother called, warm again, almost tearful. "I knew you'd do the right thing," she said. "I told your father she won't let her brother down." I didn't correct her on the phone. I could have. It would have been easy to say the words and end it right there in her ear. But some truths are owed in person, and I had decided this was one of them. So I let her believe what she needed to believe for a few more days. Not out of cruelty, but because I had one more thing I was required to do. And I would not skip a step to spare anyone discomfort, including myself. Midweek, an investigator contacted me. It was procedure, nothing more. They had seen my disclosure and wanted to confirm the recusal on the record. The conversation lasted only a few minutes. I told them I had stepped back from anything connected to the matter, that I had no involvement and wanted none, and that I would not be commenting on the substance of a case I knew nothing about and intended to keep knowing nothing about. They thanked me. That was all. It was the most undramatic phone call of my life, and it was also the moment the last door quietly closed. My family thought I was their fixer. The truth was the exact opposite, and they didn't know it yet. The family meeting they had called to collect their favor was now going to be the place where they found out they had never had one. In those few days of misunderstanding, my father did something that would have been funny if it hadn't been so revealing. He started telling people I was handling it. My mother let it slip on the phone, the way she let most things slip, half by accident and half because she wanted me to know my father was, for once, speaking well of me. "Your dad told the Hendersons his daughter's at the Pentagon, taking care of Nathan's situation," she said, and I could hear the pride in it. Finally, the pride I had wanted my whole life arriving now for a thing I would never do. There it was. My father had spent decades refusing to be proud of me for my actual work, and the first time he bragged about me to the neighbors, it was for a crime I had no intention of committing. I felt no temptation to set him straight by phone. The misunderstanding would correct itself soon enough in person, in the only room where it would mean anything. Then my mother delivered the line, the one I had heard my whole life, the one that used to make me sit up straight and rearrange my schedule. "We need to talk," she said. "Family meeting tomorrow. Your father wants to thank you properly. Family meeting tomorrow." Once those words had carried the whole weight of the household summons, I would have crossed a state to answer. Now they were just words, hollow as a knocked-on door with no one behind it, because I already knew what I was bringing to that meeting. And it was not the thing they were planning to thank me for ... I'll be there, I said. And for the first time in my life, I was not afraid of that table. You might be wondering why I bothered going at all. I had already done everything the law and my conscience required. I could have stayed on base, sent a short message, blocked their numbers, and let the distance do the rest. It would have been cleaner. It would have been safer for my own heart. I thought about it, but I had spent my whole life letting hard things go, unsettled at that table swallowing them to keep the peace. And I had finally understood what all that swallowing had bought me: nothing. A reserve of obligation they thought they could spend. If I disappeared by text, I would be the steady one last time absorbing, avoiding, keeping the calm. And I was done being that. A boundary you never say out loud is not a boundary. It's just a secret you keep from the people who keep stepping over it. I needed to draw the line in the exact place it had been crossed. At that wooden table, in that warm and dishonest room, in front of all of them. Not to punish them, not to win, to finish, in my own voice, a sentence my family had been interrupting for 36 years. I took my grandfather's letter out of the drawer and put it back in my jacket pocket. I didn't need to read it again. I knew the line by heart. Integrity is the only thing they can't reassign. I was not going to that meeting to fight. I was going to that meeting to keep a promise I had made to a quiet man in a folded letter, and to a quieter version of myself who had waited a very long time to be heard. I drove out that Saturday in civilian clothes. That was a decision, not an accident. I could have worn the uniform with the New Oak Leaf could have walked into that house wearing the rank they suddenly found impressive. I didn't. I was not going there to win an argument about whose service counted. I was not going there to be the lieutenant colonel. I was going as the daughter, on level ground, which was the one place my father had never been willing to meet me. So I wore jeans and a plain coat. In the inside pocket of that coat sat a folded letter and the kind of calm that does not come from confidence so much as from being finally, completely sure of yourself. On the passenger seat beside me lay a plain manila folder. It didn't contain anything secret. It held copies of the disclosure and recusal I had filed there, paperwork that proved I had already stepped fully out of Nathan's reach and my family's reach in the same motion. I didn't bring it to threaten anyone. I brought it because I had learned that families, like mine, argue with the truth, right up until they are looking at it on paper. I wanted there to be no more room for just one phone call. I wanted the door to be visibly, permanently shut. I pulled into the driveway. The garage was open, coffee and motor all in the cold air. The smell of a childhood I was about to close behind me. I picked up the folder and went in. They were all there, arranged like a welcome and waiting like a verdict. My father at the head of the table, expansive, almost jovial, a man who believed he had already won. My mother hovering with the coffee pot. Nathan in a clean shirt, looking better than he had the week before, buoyed by the belief that his big sister was about to make his problem disappear. Unessa beside him with my nephew. And the little boy had been dressed up high. Notice the way you dress a child when you want the adults to remember he is watching. My father started before I had even sat down. There she is, he said, warm as I had ever heard him. The fixer. Sit, sit. Your mother made coffee. I sat. I set the plain manila folder on the table in front of me, squared it with the edge, and folded my hands on top of it. Every eye in the room went to that folder, because a folder in a moment like this looks like power. They thought it was the instrument of the favor. They thought I had brought the means of making their problem go away. My father leaned back, satisfied, ready to receive the gift of his daughter's compliance. Now, he said, tell us what you can do for your brother. The clock on the wall ticked. The coffee steamed. My nephew swung his small feet under the table. And I took a breath, the slow kind, the kind you take before you say the truest thing you have ever said to people who don't want to hear it. They had called this meeting to collect. I had come to close the account. The difference between those two purposes was about to fill the room. I can't do anything for Nathan, I said. And I need you to hear why, because I'm only going to say it once. The warmth drained from my father's face by degrees, like water leaving a sink. I kept my voice level and went on. The day after I left here, I did what the law required me to do. I disclosed that a relative of mine might be connected to a matter near my work. I formally recused myself, which means I've stepped completely away from anything that touches Nathan's case. I will never see it, never touch it, never know a single fact about it that I'm not supposed to. I rested my hand flat on the folder, and I reported that this family asked me to interfere with a federal investigation. I wrote down what was said in this house not to hurt anyone, but because I'm required to, and because I won't lie, not even by silence. That was the surprise they hadn't seen coming. There was no phone call to make, no door left to open, no favor I was negotiating the price of. I had already shut every door days ago, through the proper channels, before I ever drove out. The fixer they had invited to dinner did not exist and never had. An investigation isn't a verdict, I said, gentler now, because the next part was true and they needed it to be true. If Nathan did nothing wrong, the process will show that. That's what the process is for. But if he did, no call from me changes it. It only ends my career in the same fire as his. And I'm not getting in that fire, not for a favor, not even for family. I slid the folder an inch toward the center of the table. The copies inside it were plain and undramatic and absolutely final. That's already done, I said. It can't be undone. So there's nothing to decide. I just wanted to tell you in person. Then I stopped talking and let the silence do the rest. The room came apart and I stayed in one piece. And that was the whole story of my life compressed into 90 seconds. My father stood so fast his chair scraped back and hit the wall. You did what? His voice climbed to a place I had heard maybe twice in 36 years. You wrote us down. Your own family? You little after everything. He called me a traitor. He called me cold. He said I had always thought I was better than them. And for once, I didn't argue. Because a small, tired part of me thought that maybe wanting to keep my word did make me different, and I had stopped being ashamed of it. Nathan went pale and then loud. You ruined me, he said. You understand that. You just handed them everything. I hadn't, of course. I had touched nothing of his case, but a drowning man blames the shore. My mother put her hands over her mouth and said my name like a wound. And Vanessa, who had saved her ammunition for exactly this, pulled. My nephew tied against her and aimed him at me like the last shell in the chamber. Is this what you want? She said, her voice breaking on cue. You want him to grow up without a father. You could stop this, and you're choosing not to. Look at him. Look at him and tell him. I looked at him. He was 6 and frightened by the noise. And he didn't understand any of it. And he deserved better than to be used this way by every adult in that room, including the ones who claimed to love him most. I looked at him, and then I looked at Vanessa. And I kept my voice as steady as a hand on a rail. Family doesn't ask you to break the law to save them, I said. That's not love. That's a setup. And I won't teach him that it works. Then I stood and picked up my coat, and not one of them could stop me because there was nothing left to take. My father made one last attempt to put me back in my old chair. Sit down, he said. We're not done. I stopped at the edge of the room, coat in hand, and turned to face him. And I gave him the only thing I had left to give, which was the truth returned to him in the same coin he had paid me. Do you remember, I said, what you told me when I asked you to come to my ceremony? You said you wouldn't waste your time on my little promotion. I let it sit there a moment. That word waste, the one that had cost me so much sleep. I'm not going to waste my integrity covering this. So I think that makes us even. My father had no answer. For the first time in my life, the locked door of him had nothing on the other side but a man who had run out of room to push. My mother spoke then, quietly from her chair, and her voice held the only thing in that house that came close to honest. I only ever tried to keep the peace, she said. And I believe she did. I believe she spent 40 years lowering my temperature so the man at the head of the table wouldn't boil. And I believe she told herself that was love. So I gave her the truth, too gently, because she was the one person there I didn't enjoy wounding. Mom, I said, a peace built on my silence was never peace. It was just my turn to lose, over and over. I touched a letter in my pocket that folded. Promise from the one man in my family who had understood me. Then I walked out of that house into the cold and the smell of coffee and motor oil. And I didn't look back. And I didn't break. The rest happened slowly. The way real things do not in the tidy rush people expect from a story. Months passed before there was any public word. An indictment was eventually unsealed. And I learned about it the same way the neighbors did, from the news. Because I had kept myself a complete stranger to the case and intended to stay one. An indictment, I will remind you, is only an accusation. It is not a verdict. And Nathan was entitled to the same presumption of innocence as anyone would ever. I privately suspected. In time, he reached an agreement rather than go to trial. What that meant for him exactly was for a court to settle, not for me to narrate with relish. I take no pleasure in my brother's troubles. He made his own choices long before I made mine, and the consequences were always going to be his to carry. As for me, the thing my family had been so sure would ruin me did the opposite. Because I had disclosed and recused the moment, I had a reason to buy the book and on the record my own standing was never in question. If anything, the careful handling of an impossible situation was noted quietly by the kind of people whose quiet notice matters in a career like mine. I kept my posting. I kept my clearance. I kept the one thing my grandfather told me they could never reassign. My family didn't call for a long time. My father never did. My mother eventually reached out once, and I answered kindly and briefly and held the line I had finally learned to hold. The distance, it turned out, was not a wound. It was just room. Room I had needed for a very long time. I never did get the front row family I had saved those 2 chairs for. I made my peace with that real peace this time. The kind that doesn't require anyone else's silence to hold. A few weeks after the meeting, the soldiers from my cell took me to a plain dinner at a place with paper menus and good pie. Sergeant Reeves raised a glass and said something kind and slightly off-color, and I laughed until my eyes watered. That was the celebration the lieutenant colonel in me had been owed. Not a ceremony, but a table of people who showed up. When I got home that night, I took the spare oak leaf out of the drawer where it had lived since the day I pinned the first one on alone. It wasn't cold anymore. It had been in a warm house, in a warm pocket carried by a woman who had finally stopped waiting for the wrong people to make her feel proud. I set it on the shelf beside my grandfather's letter. The 2 of them belonged together. They were the only inheritance I had ever actually wanted. The highest rank I ever earned was never pinned to my collar. It was the quiet morning. I stopped letting people who refused to show up decide what I was worth. That is my story. A father who skipped the ceremony. A brother who wanted a favor I could never give. And a boundary I should have set years sooner than I did. If there is someone in your life who only calls you family when they need something, hear me on this. You are allowed to stop answering. You are allowed to draw the line out loud. Said it today. Please subscribe my channel and like heartwarming tales.